Hello there. Last one of the day, always not the great slot, and I got to follow Larry Speck, one of my favorite people in the world, one of the best teachers around here, so temper your expectations. I'm reminded of a friend of mine in the business school, started here in about 1970, and he had research that was kind of narrow and very quantitative and really not of a lot of interest to the general audience, and yet the university wanted to send him out as one of our bright new hires from an Ivy League school and give him a big talk, and so he was sent out to Amarillo to talk to a group out there, and kind of a bunch of cowboys out in Amarillo, and so he's up on the lectern and he's giving his talk, and everybody's eyes are glazing over, but he doesn't know what else to do, so he just keeps going on, and more eyes are glazing over. And finally, he told me, some really big cowboy got up in the back. He's got the hat on, he's got the cowboy boots, he seems like about 8 feet tall. He just starts walking down the aisle toward the front with this scowl on his face. And my friend, who's about my size, sort of starts cowering behind the lectern like he's gonna get clobbered. And the cowboy looks at him and says, "Don't worry, little fella, I'm not mad at you. I'm looking for the guy who invited you." And that's kind of how I feel following Larry Speck, but what are you gonna do? So somewhere around here, I put my little pointer, I'll find it sooner or later, but yeah, I usually like to start talks like this with a little quiz. And so I want you to think about things like insider trading, adultery, tax evasion, other bad things that people do. And think about this. Is this true for you? I have solid, well-considered ethical beliefs that can be changed only by reasoned arguments or new evidence. Now, no abstentions here. How many of you would say that applies to me? Anyone? Anyone? How many of you would say, nope, that's not me at all? Got a few hands. Okay, good. How about this one? Thinking about those same things, insider trading, adultery, tax evasion. How about this one? I have character and integrity that will carry me through difficult situations and hard choices. How many of you, that applies to you? Got a lot of hands there. How many of you say, no, that's not me at all? Only got one or two hands. Okay, I know who to keep an eye on. That's good. So here's the deal. I teach business ethics in a business school, and in a business school, it seems to me you need to be talking about stuff like this because there are always headlines. I give talks like this all the time. 2015, headlines like this: VW starts selling cars facing U.S. inquiry. That's cost them $30 billion or more already, and is going to cost them more. Cheating at UT, an ongoing challenge, still is today. Once a neglected treatment, now an expensive specialty drug. You remember Pharma Boy, who bought the drug and pumped it up from $13.50 to $750 per dose. He just went to jail recently, so good on him. 2016, similar stuff, the Panama Papers, $770 billion hidden by wealthy Americans away from the tax guy, how Fox News women took down Roger Ailes in a sexual harassment thing, EpiPen prices, again, we had some more gouging, 600% increase. 2017, Uber's unraveling. Of course, we had all sorts of issues with Uber, running from sexual harassment to trying to evade regulation. Harvey Weinstein started off the Me Too movement. A 99 case of bottled water down in Houston after Harvey. Again, more price gouging. And then, of course, it's 2018, and we continue to have these sorts of things going on. The Equifax hack in the headlines a lot. Theranos founder charged with massive fraud, $700 million. And just yesterday, headline of the paper, an ex-CEO of Houston therapy chain gets prison 19 years for kind of a Medicaid reimbursement fraud thing going on. So there's stuff like this going on all the time. So in a business school, we have to think about how we're going to teach business ethics. What is it that's going to work? And I've been teaching ethics for a long time, and I've tried a lot of different ways, and there are various approaches. I have to tell you that one of my favorites has to do with kind of the sermon approach. You just preach to little bastards and tell them they got to be good people, and you just go after them. And I'm a big fan of Jonathan Edwards. You probably read his stuff in middle school or grade school or high school back upon a time, but you remember him, the old Puritan guy who could really wind up and bring it. Thus it is that natural men are held in the hand of God over the pit of hell. They deserve the fiery pit and are already sentenced to it, and on and on. You got flames, you got the devil, you got spiders, you got all sorts of stuff. And this guy could go on for hours talking about this stuff. And I got to tell you that as the preacher in this situation, you find this very cathartic. It's kind of a lot of fun to go and rage at the little students and tell them how they need to be good people and do the right thing. So I enjoy that as an approach to teaching ethics, but I found over time it's really not necessarily the most effective approach. And so another thing that I use oftentimes is the hypothetical dilemma. You basically, the idea here is that you present the students with a hypothetical dilemma, ethical dilemma, and let them wrestle with it there in class. With the notion that if they get some practice, when they run into an ethical challenge out in the real world, they will be able to reason through to a right conclusion. And so you practice, and away you go. And my favorite one involves a time machine. So hypothetically, you may have run across this one before, but work with me. I have invented a time machine. I haven't perfected it yet, but I've got it so that if I just push a button, I can send you to any time in history that I want to send you, and any place that I want to send you. But because I haven't perfected it, you'll only be there for 10 seconds, and then you'll pop back here. But I'm getting ready to send you there. But before I do, I'm going to give everybody, again, work with me here, a gun. If this is Texas, I can do this. So I've got a gun. Everybody's going to get a gun. It's got one bullet in it. And I want you to raise your hand if in your 10 seconds you're going to pull the trigger. Because, as you probably guessed, I'm going to send you to the Vienna, Austria, the nursery of little baby Adolf Hitler in 1890, and ask if you're going to pull the trigger in your 10 seconds as you're going to be there. If you're going to pull the trigger, do me a favor and raise your hand and keep it up. If not, don't. Boom, there you are. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, no abstentions, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Okay, I've got a few people who are going to pull the trigger. Why are you going to pull the trigger?
Why?
Yep.
Because the Second World War was probably the worst conflagration worldwide. If Hitler had, the Japanese got sucked into that deal because of Hitler. It was just 6 million people died.
So we're pulling the trigger to save lives.
All I'm saying is, for that example, yeah, I would pull the trigger.
You got the butterfly effect. You got the time-space continuum, excuse me. You got the microphone stand that's attacking you. We never know exactly how, if we change history, things might play out, but there's at least a pretty good argument that if you took Hitler out of the equation, World War II might not have happened, might not have been nearly as bad. You might have saved millions and millions of lives. That would be one good reason to pull the trigger. But a lot of people didn't pull the trigger. Why not? Why didn't you pull the trigger?
Because I believe someone else would take this place.
You think it wouldn't make any difference. Somebody else would take his place who might be as crazy and effective as Hitler, or even worse. That strikes me as unlikely, but possible, certainly possible. Why didn't you pull the trigger?
Because I couldn't decide what I would do in 10 seconds.
You got to have more than 10 seconds. Well, I'm working on it. I'm trying to perfect the machine. When I get it for like 20 seconds, I'm going to come back to you. How about you? You didn't raise your hand.
Well, I really can't hear enough to answer your question.
That's fair enough. That's fair enough. I am getting there myself. How about you?
I just couldn't kill anyone.
You just couldn't kill anybody. Doesn't seem like the right thing to do, right? It's a baby. It's just sitting there looking up at you.
No. Well, you do now.
One more person who didn't pull the trigger. Why not?
Because we can't know what would have happened.
Okay. Right. You can't know for sure. That's fair enough. So the reason that you throw out a situation like this is that people come up with reasons for why they do or don't take action, and you kind of weigh those and you put them within some sort of a philosophical framework. When you're thinking about, for example, deontology, that's Immanuel Kant. That's the idea of you follow rules. You're supposed to follow the rules. And if you follow the rules, normally you get the right result. And so people who are thinking thou shalt not kill, for example, oftentimes say, well, I don't pull the trigger. You're not supposed to kill people. Perfectly legitimate resolution, I think, to this situation. But another approach is the utilitarian approach. John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, and the idea there is greatest good for the greatest number, what gives you the best result. And if you think you've got a pretty good chance of saving millions of lives, in that case you do pull the trigger. And then of course there's a theory called virtue ethics that comes from Aristotle and his gang, and the idea that, well, don't worry so much about philosophy, worry about being a good person. Work every day at having the type of virtues that a good person has, at being honest, being responsible, having integrity, and on and on and on. And if you do those sorts of things, you'll probably do the right thing if you run into an ethical challenge. And if you're not the kind of person who kills people, I think that's a perfectly legitimate answer to say, I'm not the kind of person who kills people. Hitler's the kind of person who kills people. I'm not going to be that kind of person. I think that's kind of the answer that you gave me. And all those are legitimate ways, I think, to wrestle with this particular ethical dilemma. Some people see that picture and change their mind, decide, okay, maybe I should have pulled the trigger. So the approach that I use to talk about ethics mostly these days changed a few years ago, and it had to do with a couple of dinners I was at. In one of them, I was at the Four Seasons downtown. A friend of mine had bought a table at a charity event, and I was sitting next to a guy who I didn't know, but seemed like a nice guy, and we shot the breeze all evening long. And I have to tell you, when we were driving home, I told my wife, man, I really liked that guy. He was awesome. I'd like to get to know him better. He loved UT Sports. I loved UT Sports. We talked about our families. He talked a lot about his church. We talked about our jobs. We had so much in common that it was just a wonderful evening. A couple weeks later, I was back at the University of Kansas, where I am from. I grew up on a farm in Kansas, and I went to KU. I was there for a reunion, had lunch with a guy who, again, great guy. We had a lot of fun. We had a lot in common. He wasn't as much into sports, but we talked about our jobs, talked about our families. He talked about his church. Awesome. Told my wife I'd love to get to know that guy better. Well, it turns out both those guys, who I thought seemed a whole lot like me, and were, frankly, had both been to jail for significant white-collar crimes of the type that were headlines in the newspaper. And it got me thinking to myself, kind of, okay, why not me? It was one of those there but for the grace of God go I sort of moments, because I had very much in common with those two. Why did they go to jail and I've never gone to jail? And it could be just a little bit of good luck, it dawned on me, or the fact that I wasn't in situations they have been in. So when I teach ethics to my little students, the word of the day is humility. It's be humble. Because it's hard to be the kind of person your dog thinks you are every single day, with all the pressures we face out in the real world. Quote that I like is, if we are good, it may be because we were never tempted enough, frightened enough, or put in desperate enough need. Or face the situations that my guys faced. So part of the problem here has to do with our brains and illusions that our brains can cause us. So I'm really not very good with videos and stuff, but I'm going to try to show you a video. Who's heard of the McGurk effect in here? Anybody heard of the McGurk effect? Well, you're going to learn about the McGurk effect then. Show you a little video here, if I can get it up and running and our sound is working the way it's supposed to. Do me a favor and watch the screen very carefully.
But look what happens when we change the dictum. And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing ba with a B. It's an illusion known as the McGurk effect. Take another look. Concentrate first on the right of the screen. Now to the left of the screen. The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
Is that not a little freaky? We think that we see with our eyes and we hear with our ears, but of course we do both with our brains. And when our brain gets conflicting signals, ba, ba, ba is bouncing off our eardrums, And that's the only sound that ever bounced off your eardrums during that clip. But we see a guy mouthing fa, 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 and our eyes are getting the signal for fa, fa, fa. Our brain gets those conflicting signals and it has to make a decision. And for most people, when a guy is going fa, fa, fa with his mouth, your brain will interpret that as ba, ba, as fa, 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 even though ba, ba, ba is what's bouncing off your eardrums. Weird. That is an auditory illusion. Check it out on YouTube. There are a million different clips of the McGurk effect. It always freaks me out to see it. There are, of course, also optical illusions. Oh, darn, I thought I had another one. I put another one on today or this morning and must have deleted it accidentally. So I'm going to need some help with this one. Who am I going to pick on now? I think I'm going to pick on Stan. Stan, help me out. I've got two tables there. I really need Larry Speck here because he's the architect, but I've got two tables. Would you describe for us the shape of the tops of those two tables?
Rectangle and square.
Rectangle and square. Does that look about right to everybody? The one on the left looks kind of rectangular. The one on the right looks square. Cool. I wish I had a really big piece of paper. But I'm going to have to leave it to you guys to look this up on the internet. Look up the shepherd's table illusion. Because if you take a piece of paper and you put it on top of this one on your computer screen, and you trace it, and then you put it on top of this one on your computer screen, you'll see those are exactly the same shape. Precisely. I've looked at that a million times. I can't believe it, but I swear to God it's true. If you don't believe me, come up after my little talk. We'll get a piece of paper, we'll put it on my computer screen, and we'll trace it, and you'll see they're exactly the same. That's my favorite optical illusion. There are even tactile illusions, and here's my favorite one of these. So we've got a woman here, and this is her real right hand. They placed it through this box, though, and there's a flap over the box, so she can't see her real right hand. Parallel to it, which she can see, is a rubber arm with a rubber hand on it. Well, if psychologists will take a couple of feathers and rub her real right hand, which she can feel, and the rubber right hand, which she can see, after about 2 minutes, her brain, for 60% of us, our brains will rewire and we'll start thinking of the rubber hand as if it's our own hand. If somebody tries to stick a pin in it, we'll jump because we don't want it to happen. These are the types of illusions that our brain plays on us. Auditory illusions, optical illusions, tactile illusions, and I put it to you that if the brain can fool all those senses, it can also fool our moral sense. And now there's a huge body of research that supports that idea. So if we go back to question one, I have solid, well-considered ethical beliefs that can be changed only by reasoned arguments or new evidence. The answer to that actually is very commonly false. A psychologist, by changing some of the things I'm going to talk about in a little bit, can turn you all sorts of ways in positions you take on what's ethical and what's not ethical. Regarding this one, I have character and integrity that will carry me through difficult situations and hard choices. This is for the most part true, thank goodness. But it's false enough of the time for most of us that we need to be wary. We need to be careful. So there's a new field called behavioral ethics research. And the idea is that in the last 100 years or so, we've started studying how and why people make the decisions that they make. And that's great. As of about 15 years ago, we started focusing on moral decisions. How do people and why do people make the moral decisions that they make? And using research from behavioral psychology, cognitive science, evolutionary biology, brain science, and a whole bunch of other fields, we found a whole bunch of interesting things. And the overwhelming finding here is that most people want to think of themselves as good people. 1% of people maybe are psychopaths and don't care, but the rest of us, we want to be good people. And we think of ourselves as good people. And we want others to think of us as good people. And yet, people frequently act unethically. Usually in minor ways, it's hard for us to rob banks or murder people and still think of ourselves as good folks, although that has been done. But in minor ways, we do it all the time. A little quotation here about how often people lie if they don't monitor themselves. It seems to be a natural thing, an easy thing for people to do, to lie, again, in little ways, but in ways you wouldn't want to be caught on. You wouldn't want your mom or your children to know about. You wouldn't want it on the front page of the newspaper. Happens too often. Our accomplice that lets us simultaneously think of ourselves as good people and yet do these bad things is our brain. Although we think of ourselves as rational beings, like Spock from Star Trek, actually we make most of our moral decisions instinctively and emotionally, not cognitive, slowly, and rationally. Research clearly demonstrates a lot of factors affect human decision making in the moral area, including social and organizational pressures. I'm going to talk about a couple of those: obedience to authority and the conformity bias. There are also cognitive biases and heuristics. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that our brain just kind of automatically takes. I'm going to talk about a few of those: the overconfidence bias, framing, role morality, incrementalism, and the self-serving bias. And finally, there are a bunch of situational factors, so just stuff around us that affects decisions we make. We may not realize it: time pressure, something called self-control depletion, and the notion of transparency. So let me get started on that. Social and organizational pressures can affect our ethical decision making in ways we don't realize, and the key one is obedience to authority. The most famous study in all of psychology, I think, is the Stanley Milgram study, and you probably remember this from psychology that you might have taken back in college. Stanley Milgram wanted to know why so many perfectly normal German citizens became part of Hitler's death machine. They went to church on Sunday, they had children, why would they become part of Hitler's death machine? He thought, well, maybe Germans had a particular susceptibility to being obedient to authority. Maybe it was part of a national trait. So he decided he'd study it here in the United States, and he set up an experiment that you're probably familiar with. The basic idea is we got a guy in a white lab coat, he's the experimenter here. He brings two people into the lab and he explains to them, we're going to run a little experiment here. One of you is going to ask questions to the other one, and we're going to measure the impact of negative reinforcement on learning. We'll administer some electric shocks when you miss questions, and we'll see if that improves your performance. And we're going to see who's the student and who's the teacher. And they flip a coin. No matter what the coin does, one of the people is a confederate of the experimenter, and he's going to be designated the student. And we take him to the room next door, we strap him up to this electrical looking kind of machine, and then we slide a panel so that we can't see him. The person we're really testing, the subject of the experiment, is given the role of the teacher. He's put in front of this panel with dials and buttons and a control panel that says slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger severe shock, triple X, so bad we don't even have a word for it. And the question is, well, the experiment starts with the guy in the lab coat says, okay, ask the first question. Well, we ask the first question. The guy misses it. Oh, we'll administer the shock. So the guy we're really testing pushes a button right in front of him. He hears a little bzzzt. The guy next door goes, ouch. And then we turn up the dial a little bit, and we ask the next question, and he misses that one. Administer the shock, pushes the button, a little louder, bzzzt, a little louder, ow. And the question is, as the guy keeps missing questions, and the shock keeps getting more severe, and the guy starts saying, please, I want to stop. You're hurting me. This is awful. I want to quit. I've got a heart condition. You're killing me here. Will people keep pushing the button and administering the shock? Just because some guy in a white lab coat with a little semblance of authority tells him to. Well, they asked people before they ever ran the experiment, will Americans, not Germans, will Americans do that? And 99% said no, most people said no. Maybe 1% of Americans are crazy enough to do that, psychopaths, but no, Americans won't do that. They asked trained psychologists, they said, oh, 1% too high, maybe 1 in 10,000 will do it. Well, then they ran the experiment, and even though this guy playing the role of the student is begging to stop, and the teacher is saying, I think we're hurting this guy. I really think we ought to quit. When the guy in the white lab coat says, the experiment must continue, 65% of Americans topped it out, went all the way to the end. 100% of Americans in the experiment went to severe shock, intense shock. So it turns out we're kind of wired to be obedient to authority. I think of, well, who do I think of? I think of Bud Crow. So awfully nice to have people in my age range here. at least a fair number of them. I was just wondering, I've been at UT so long, I probably had some of your parents in class, but Charles, help me out here. Who do we have in that picture?
Nixon and Elvis.
Elvis, you have, maybe you remember the story of Elvis showed up at the White House one day and said, hey, I want to see Nixon. And they didn't know what to do, but it's Elvis, so they took him in, and I think he presented Nixon with a couple of guns that had the handles inscribed, et cetera, et cetera. But the third guy here is Eagle Bud Crow. He was a young staffer in the White House, and those of you who remember Watergate, remember he was one of the famous people in Watergate. Because when we had our little Pentagon Papers thing, which we recently had the Meryl Streep, Tom Hanks movie about, he was the one who was summoned to the White House and told, hey, our guy who leaked these papers, we have got to discredit him. So you're going to take these fellows over here, who later became the plumbers who broke into the Watergate Hotel. You're going to take them out to Los Angeles, and you're going to break into the psychiatrist's office of the guy who's leaking the papers because we need to discredit him. Don't get caught. Well, he did that. They didn't find anything, but he didn't get caught. They only got caught later when they broke into the Watergate Hotel. But later, when people started being arrested in the Watergate scandal, Bud Crow said to himself, holy crap, what was I doing? What was I thinking? All I was trying to do was please my bosses. They are kind of the most powerful people in the world. But I wasn't using my own moral standards, and if I'd done that, I wouldn't have done this. And he went to Judge Sirica and said, man, I screwed up. I will plead guilty. I'm not asking for any favors. I'll testify against anybody you want me to testify against. And he spent pretty much the rest of his life trying to make up for that error. But the scary thing here is he didn't see what was wrong right in front of him because he was focusing so much on pleasing his bosses. He wasn't looking at the moral issue. He didn't see the moral issue. He was just focusing on do the task, don't get caught, please the boss. Sometimes we do what the boss tells us to because it's the boss. And we know we shouldn't do it. We know it's wrong, but we don't want to buck the boss. He didn't even see that it was wrong. At least that's what he's told me a couple times, and I think I tend to believe him, which makes this all scary. Studies show that CFOs are more likely to fudge the numbers if it puts money in the CEO's pocket than if it puts money in their own pocket, because they're also wired to please the boss. That's obedience to authority. You got to keep an eye on it. I tell my little students, everybody wants to please the boss. A million practical reasons to do it. We're wired to do it. We're raised to please our parents, our teachers, the policeman down the block. But if we focus too much on that, we miss ethical issues and we do the wrong stuff. The conformity bias looks at things more horizontally than up and down, but in general, we tend to take our cues as to how to act from the people around us. Solomon Asch, also interested in the Holocaust, thought that this might have had something to do with the conformity bias. And so, Rosemary, can I ask you a question? So this is not an illusion, I should tell you. This is actually real stuff. I've got a line over here, and I've got 3 lines here, A, B, and C. Can you tell me which line, A, B, or C, is the same length as this one?
I think it's C.
Looks like C, right? If everybody were close enough to see this closely, I think pretty much everybody would say, yeah, it's C. When he ran the experiment, 99% of people said C, and he sent the rest of them out to the optometrist. That was iteration number 1 of the study. Iteration number 2 is we bring Rosemary in with 5 other people. And the 5 other people are all Confederates of Asch. And the first one says A, and the second one says A, and the third one says A, and the fourth one says A, and the fifth one says A, and now we ask Rosemary, and again, about 65 or 70% of the time, Rosemary would say, A? She knows it's not A. It's right there in black and white it's not A, but we are so used to taking our cues as to how to act from other people that we will say A even when it's obviously not. Think about an ethical situation where it's not black and white. It's gray. And the people in the room aren't total strangers, as they were in the Asch experiment. They're your coworkers who you need to get along with, who you like and who you respect. When they all point one direction, it's pretty hard for you to point the other way. It's hard for you to keep to your own moral compass when everybody else's needle is pointing a different direction. I think of Betty Vincent of WorldCom. You may remember this from the dot-com boom back around 2000. We had the big collapse. WorldCom went from being the biggest provider of broadband in the world to a company that was bankrupt. And Betty Vinson, you basically had the CFO, guy below the CFO, and Betty. And Betty's boss came in one day and said, hey, we're not making our numbers this quarter. We've got to do something because our stock price is going to get hammered if we don't make the numbers. We just need to take these numbers over here and put them over here. And Betty said, but they don't belong over here. Yeah, I know that, but it's going to be a disaster if we don't, so just this one quarter we got to do it. Well, Betty knew she shouldn't do it, but she wanted to be a team player, and she did it. Some obedience to authority there probably as well. They promised her, never have to do it again. But of course, the next quarter they come back in and they're looking to change a number that's 10 times as big. And Betty says, we can't do this. This is wrong. And I said, Betty, you got to help us out. You just think of the company as an airplane. It's getting ready to land on the aircraft carrier. You got to help us out, help us land the plane. Then you can quit, you can retire, anything you want, but you got to help us this one more time. She was proud of the company. They'd gone from a tiny little company to the biggest employer in Mississippi. She really wanted to help out, so she signed off on it. But there she is doing the perp walk, a 40-some-year-old grandmother with a federal securities felony conviction on her record because she wanted to be a part of the team. Here's maybe my favorite study. Had college kids. Brought in 1,000 of them, gave them a series of math questions. How many can you get right in 20 minutes out of 20 questions? And so they do it. We get kind of a baseline. On average, I don't remember the number, let's say on average, you get 12 right. Okay, cool. So then in a second iteration study, they bring in similar college students. They give them the same questions, but in this case, they give them the opportunity to grade their own exam, to shred it so they can't be second guessed, and to get a reward. The more they get right, the more money they get. Well, all of a sudden, 12 became 14. Nobody said, oh, I got all 20 right and just lied outright, but it's really easy to rationalize, oh, if I just had another second, I could have gotten that one, and I almost got that one, I don't know what I was thinking, but normally I would have gotten that. So it's easy to fudge on a couple to get a little more money, especially when you're not going to be checked. In a third iteration of the study, this was happening at Carnegie Mellon University, right after they got started, when a guy could not possibly have had enough time to do all the problems, a guy wearing a CMU sweatshirt jumps up and says, hey, I got them all right. Where do I get my money? Well, now all of a sudden, 14 became 16. Because we've seen that guy. He clearly cheated. Must be okay to cheat. And more people cheated. And in the final iteration of the study, the guy who jumps up and says, I got them all right, is wearing the sweatshirt of their arch rival, their hated rival, their version of A&M for us, Pitt. And now we went back to 12. Because the bad guys cheat. We just saw the bad guy cheat. We take our cues from people in our in-group, not people in our out-group. And 16 became 12 again. Final example, I think about this. Back around the turn of the century, those of you who are paying attention know that there were a lot of big accounting firms, a lot of big law firms selling bogus tax shelters to really rich people and rich corporations and making tons of money doing it. And KPMG was behind the curve, not keeping up with everybody else. So they hired a guy away from a competing firm and said, hey, we need you to come over and create some of those fancy little devices you've got and do it for us. So he did. When they ran them by quality control up in Chicago, the guys in Chicago looked at him and said, at least one of them did, wait a minute, this is utterly bogus. If the IRS looks at this, there's no way they will approve it. Here's the email he got back. You're either on the team or off the team. What's it going to be? Well, everybody wants to be on the team. It's hard not to be on the team. Nobody wants to be off the team. And oftentimes we will, again, sometimes go along just because we feel we have to. We'll be fired if we don't, etc. But other times we're so focused on getting along, we don't even see the moral issue. That's the conformity bias. Final example. Who's been to the petrified forest? All right. Got these little petrified things. They're really cool. They had a little problem. People like to pick up just a little souvenir and put it in their pocket and walk out. They wanted to stop that. Your heritage, they put up a sign, your heritage is being stolen, 14 tons of rock a year, disappearing mostly by visitors pilfering in small amounts. The effect of putting up that sign, pilfering tripled. Everybody's doing it, must be okay. That's the conformity bias. Let me talk about cognitive heuristics, which again are mental shortcuts and biases. One is the overconfidence bias, kind of a tricky one. I teach a lot of MBAs. They're 26, 27, 28. About half of them usually are either married or about to get married. And I just always ask them, okay, great, you're about to get married. How many of you are ever going to get divorced? Well, I've been doing this for like 25 years. I've never seen a hand. Nobody ever thinks they're going to get divorced. Even though they know intellectually that half of all marriages end in divorce, it's never going to be them. They're confident they're going to be able to pull it off when other people can't. That's my divorce example. Studies show that 75 to 80% of people think they're better than average drivers. Auditors think they're better than average auditors. They did a study of college professors. 94% said they were better than average classroom teachers. David Brooks says the human mind is an overconfidence machine. For our purposes, what's important is we also tend to be overconfident about our morals. 80% of people think they're more ethical than their co-workers, than their competitors, than other people around them. 92% of people, when asked, say they're satisfied with their moral character. In one study, more people thought they would get to heaven than that Mother Teresa got to heaven. So if you're just sure that you're more moral than Mother Teresa and the people around you, and you are satisfied with your moral character, the problem is that you may run through the world not worrying about acting morally, just confident that I'll get it right. And therefore you make decisions without being thoughtful, without asking other people for advice, without getting other viewpoints, and you may screw up completely, not intending to, just confident you're going to get stuff right. The overconfidence bias can really eat you up. Framing is another one. Psychologists, I'm sure you've heard this, have said that they can change people's answers to any question by just reframing it, by just changing the way they look at it, and that turns out often to be the case. People rate hamburgers tastier if they're labeled 75% lean than if they're labeled 25% fat. Identical hamburgers, two different labels. It's not just that they prefer, oh, I'll take that one. After tasting it, they say it tastes better. That's framing. So I was thinking about Enron. How did Enron frame its goals? Well, I've read every tell-all book about Enron that's been written, and it's pretty clear that they were so focused on stock price. Their bonuses were tied to stock price. Their debt covenants were tied to stock price. Everything was tied to stock price. I think most of their executives, when they got up in the morning, all they thought about was stock price. And I think morals and ethics kind of fell out of the frame of reference, and you make different decisions when that is the case. Arthur Andersen, their audit firm, of course, had been known for many, many years by the credo of Arthur Andersen, the original founder of the firm, who back in the 1920s was asked to fudge some numbers by, I think, a railroad up in Chicago. And he said, there's no amount of money that will get me to compromise my morals. And that was what they lived on all the way up into the 1990s, when all of a sudden they changed their point of view because they learned they were making so much more money consulting than they were auditing, that their new pitch became to companies, not we're going to be eagle eyes and make sure your numbers are right. It's let us help you with your business success. Let us be your partners. And it was just more likely that they were going to give way when they shouldn't have, and that's why Enron and Arthur Andersen aren't around anymore. Final example, Space Shuttle Challenger. You remember this one. It's been in the movies lately. So basically, Challenger's getting ready to launch, got a cold front in Florida. It's never been tested under these circumstances. So they go to the engineers who had designed the O-ring, and the engineer said, you really shouldn't launch because we've never tested the O-ring under these temperatures. It could be brittle, it could be a problem. Well, then the manager came back to him and said, wait. You know how expensive it is to relaunch? I want you to take your engineer's hats off, where you're going to be focusing on safety, and put on your management hats, where you're going to think about dollars and cents as well. Well, they went from all saying we shouldn't launch to all saying we should launch, and we all know what happens. And those engineers lived with that the rest of their lives. One of them died about 3 months ago, and it's something he talked about his entire life. Why did I make that change in my decision? It's because it got reframed for him. So one of the things I tell all my students is, you're going to be thinking about pleasing your boss and getting along with everybody else and meeting the goals you need to meet to get bonuses and raises and stuff like that. That's all fine. But keep ethics in your frame of reference, because if you don't, you can make decisions like this, which will haunt you the rest of your life. Role morality is another little one. And the idea here is that in our lives we play different roles. We are wives and mothers and employees, and we're down at the school board, and we do all sorts of different things. And the problem is sometimes we can forget our own personal moral code when we're playing the role of someone else. So let me just ask you to consider this. Little scenario. ABC Drug Company's most profitable drug, its internal studies indicate, causes 14 to 22 unnecessary deaths a year. Competitors offer a safe medication. In other words, it's not going to cause the 14 to 22 deaths a year. With the same benefits at the same price, if regulators knew of the internal study, they would ban sale of the drug. But we've buried the study, so they don't know about the internal study. So the question that I want to ask you is it ethical for ABC to continue to sell the drug? How many of you say yes, it's ethical? How many would say no, it's not? Okay, those are kind of the answers I was hoping to get. When our professor at Wharton ran this study, 97%, at 100% here pretty much, condemned the idea, said you should not sell the drug under those circumstances. But then he reframed it for them in terms of asking them to play a different role. Role morality is sort of the same as, similar to framing. He brought in another group of people. He had so many he could divide them up into groups. So he had 57 different groups and basically said, hey, you're on the board of directors of ABC. And I want you to make decisions for us today based on information that you get, and here's the information they were given. We're ABC, we just got this report, what are we going to do? Of the 57 groups asked to play the role of ABC directors, 100%, 57 out of 57 said, we should continue to sell the drug. Now they're not judging somebody else, they're playing a role of director where they've got to make money for the shareholders. 80% of the group said, and if somebody tries to stop us, we'll hire lawyers, we'll hire lobbyists, we will try to stop this. That's what role morality can do to you. When you decide, I'm not going to use my own moral judgment, I'm going to play a role of director where I've got to worry mostly about profits for shareholders. It can lead to some pretty crazy decisions. I may come back and play this movie for you later, but I want to make sure I don't run out of time. So let me go on to incrementalism. I'm part of a film project over at McCombs called Ethics Unwrapped, where we do educational ethics videos about all these concepts that I'm talking about. We put them on the internet. You can get them on YouTube. You can get them at ethicsunwrapped.utexas.edu, free for anybody in the world to use. They've been viewed in virtually every country on earth. They're used in all the top schools and been used at more than 1,000 universities across the world. So I'm just going to mention that real quick. Incrementalism, it's the slippery slope. Gino and Bazerman, two professors at Harvard Business School, talk about the boiling frog syndrome and say much unethical behavior occurs when people unconsciously lower the bar over time through small changes in ethicality. In other words, I tell my students, the most important thing they can do when they first go out in the workplace is go to work for a company where they are confident that the company's culture doesn't try to cut corners, tries as hard as they can to do things the right way. Because if you go to work for a company where they're cutting little corners, those corners become bigger and bigger and bigger, and the next thing you know, you can be in a heap of trouble. We're back to talking about the Holocaust. How did doctors who had taken the Hippocratic Oath to preserve life become part of Hitler's death machine, helping to kill the Jews and the mental defectives, quote unquote, and the gays, etc.? How did that happen? Well, a couple psychologists wanted to know. They thought, let's go ask them. So they went and found as many of those physicians who were still alive as they could and asked them. And the most common answer they got was along the lines of, well, you know, they brought me in, and for the first week, I was just asked to observe the procedure. I just watched. Then the next week, I was asked, after the procedure was over, to sign a document indicating, yes, the procedure occurred. The third week, oh, the doctor forgot one of his instruments. Would you take it to the doctor? And then the next day, it's my turn. And one of the doctors said, in the beginning, it was impossible. Afterward, it became almost routine. That's the only way to put it. When you see it over and over and over again, your mind adjusts to it, and that becomes normal. That becomes the right thing to do. And people can do horrible, horrible things because of the slippery slope. I was giving this talk a few years ago, and there was an article in the New Yorker about the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, and a couple quotations jumped out at me. You've all seen this photo? Well, here's a quotation from the article. After 4 or 5 nights of running the military intelligence block of the Abu Ghraib hard site, Davis said, "I just wanted to go home." He felt that what he did and saw there was wrong, but it was reaffirmed and reassured through the military leadership. We're at war. This is military intelligence. That's what they do. It's just a job. So a little bit of obedience to authority going on there as well. But he said, over time, you just become numb to it, and it's nothing. It just became the norm. You see it, that sucks. It sucks to be him, and that's it, and you move on. It just becomes the norm, and it doesn't seem like the wrong thing to do after a little while. Another very famous picture, used as recruiting tools against us all around the world. You've all seen this photo. The woman who took it said, in the beginning, you see somebody naked, and you see underwear on their head, and you're like, oh, that's pretty bad. I can't believe I just saw that. And then you go to bed, and you come back the next day, and you see something worse. Well, it seems like the day before wasn't so bad. Rick Causey, CAO, Chief Accounting Officer at Enron, one of our graduates, was wanting to do a deal to disguise a delay in recording a loss. Enron suffered a loss. They didn't want to admit it. They wanted to disguise it. And he talked to an executive who said, no, we're not going to do that. And then they had this conversation. Is it possible the deal is still alive? No. No chance of coming back? No. Is even a little bit of a chance of it coming back? Finally, the executive took the hint. The deal was declared undead. They did it. And the executive later said, you did it once, it smelled bad. You did it again, it didn't smell bad. And then they did it over and over and over again because it became the new norm. A recent study found financial professionals judge ethical issues like insider trading as less intense than the rest of us do. If you work on Wall Street, you're probably going to see insider trading or some such stuff going on all the time. And it kind of seems like the norm to you. It doesn't seem nearly as bad a thing as it's going to seem to the judge and the jury who don't work on Wall Street and don't see that all the time. Our brain can actually adjust to this stuff. They did a study and they found out that when most of us tell a lie, we kind of feel bad about it. We get a little guilty signal that goes to our amygdala. But the more we lie, the duller that signal becomes. It becomes less and less of a negative reinforcement, and we can just get used to lying if we let ourselves do it. Finally, in this area, let me talk about the self-serving bias affects how we collect, process, and even remember information. I imagine some people in this room watch a lot of Fox News. Other people in this room watch a lot of MSNBC. And you're probably not the same people because we like to be told what we already believe is true. We don't like to be told we're wrong. So we know who we're watching. And we also process information differently. They did a study with capital punishment, wrote up a report, talked about capital punishment, had some good stuff about it, had some bad stuff about it, showed it to people who supported capital punishment. They read it and said, yeah, that's right. That's why we have to have capital punishment. Showed the exact same report to people who opposed capital punishment. They read the same document and said, oh yeah, that's why we shouldn't have capital punishment. They read the same information but interpreted it completely differently. And then we went back 6 months later and asked them what they remembered. Well, the people who opposed capital punishment remembered facts from the report that would undermine capital punishment. The people who liked capital punishment, who supported it, remembered facts from that same report that would tend to support capital punishment. That's the self-serving bias in action. Studies show CEOs and CFOs are more likely to fudge the numbers if they get a big bonus by meeting earnings targets. Does that surprise anybody in this room? I don't think anybody finds that surprising, but that's the self-serving bias in action. The more that's at stake, the more likely we are to fudge the numbers. Studies have found the self-serving bias affects really everybody they've studied, everybody. It's just hard for us to believe it. One of my favorite studies involved physicians. They brought a bunch of physicians in and they said, hey, you know how doctors are always being wooed by the big pharma companies? They give you swag and they hold conferences in Aspen so you can ski and in the Bahamas so you can scuba dive. Does that affect how other doctors prescribe drugs? And 64% of the doctors said, well, yeah, it's kind of bribery. Yeah, it probably does affect how they prescribe drugs. Then they brought in a similar group of doctors, described the same situation and asked, does that affect how you prescribe drugs? And now only 16% of the doctors thought that it might. They could all see how it affected other people, they couldn't see how it affected them because, of course, their heart was pure, their cause was just, they would never be affected by this bribery, even though other people might be. That's a self-serving bias in action. Finally, there are even situational factors. A whole bunch of them. I'm going to talk about 3 that can affect us in ways we don't understand. One is time pressure. Great study. We've got a bunch of fresh-faced seminarians up at Princeton. And one at a time, they went to him and said, oh my goodness, we had a bunch of parents show up on campus unexpectedly. We stowed them in the chapel on the other side of campus, but the president's tied up right now. He can't get to them. Would you go over there and just keep them entertained until the president could get to them? Tell them the story about the Good Samaritan. Everybody loves that story. And so these fresh-faced little seminarians go walking across campus toward the chapel, and as they do, they happen to walk past a guy lying by the sidewalk, moaning and groaning, clearly needing a Good Samaritan. And if they're not in a hurry, virtually everyone stopped to help him, as you think you would. But in the second iteration of the study, they told the students, the parents are getting pretty upset. They've been there a long time. You need to hurry. Get over there in a hurry. And in that setting, only 63% stopped. And in the final iteration study, they said, oh man, these parents are boiling mad. You have got to get over there now. And now our kids are kind of running, and they see the guy, and they just keep on going. Only 10% stopped. They went from almost everybody stopping to help to only 10% stopping. I'm certain none of them realized that those differences in decision had everything to do with the time pressure they felt that they were under. I tell my little students, when you're at the end of the semester, and you've got all your exams you're trying to study for, and all your projects are due, and you're feeling all this time pressure, you've got to really watch yourself. Because then you are really vulnerable to giving yourself permission to not act in accordance with your own values. You've got to keep an eye on yourself. Self-control regulation has a lot to do with this as well. It takes self-control to resist temptation. We have all sorts of different temptations, and it takes self-control to resist them. But we've all got a finite amount of self-control. Some people have more than others. We've all got a finite amount, and you don't want to use it all up. So my favorite study in this area is the radish study.
There's no radish.
There's no radish here. This is an apple and a piece of cake. And I can tell you, that cake would be gone in 3 seconds if it were me. The apple could sit there all day. Well, so they ran an experiment. They brought a guy into a room and they said, hey, thanks for helping us out. We're not quite ready for you yet. We're going to take you into the next room next door. You're going to do some math problems and you're going to see how you do and you're going to report on how you did, etc. But for 15 minutes, you're going to have to stay right here. And this radish here, don't touch that radish because we need it for another experiment. So the guy, didn't touch the radish, go in, take the test. A little bit of cheating going on. Not a lot, but a little bit. In the next iteration of the experiment, the people they brought in explained the same thing to him and said, you see that warm chocolate chip cookie there? Don't touch that warm chocolate chip cookie. That's for our next experiment. Well, now the guy's sitting next to the warm chocolate chip cookie for 15 minutes. He can't touch it. When we send him into the next room, cheating went way up. They'd used their self-control, not touching the chocolate chip cookie. They didn't have enough left. They cheated way more than the radish group. So again, I tell my students, if you're on a diet, if you are training for a marathon, if you're training to do the Texas 4000, you're going to ride the bike up to Alaska, you're using a lot of your self-control already. So keep an eye on yourself. Realize that you're more vulnerable than you might be in other settings because you're using up your self-control for other purposes. Finally, transparency. I'm the head of the Business Honors Program. We do essays for high school students who want to be part of the program, and one of our prompts a couple years ago was, what does integrity mean to you? And the most common answer we got, which is a really good answer, is integrity is doing the right thing when nobody's watching. The problem is, most of us tend to do the right thing when people are watching, but not so much when people aren't. Here's my favorite experiment. They set up a coffee machine in an office, in just an office building, unattended, worked on the honor system. So people would come in, help themselves to a cup of coffee, supposed to put $1 in the kitty, and they left it there for 6 months to figure out, okay, what percentage of people are going to pay for the coffee and what percentage aren't. And when they got that baseline established, they started playing with the environment. The first thing they did was add more light. Well, cheating went down. more people paid for their coffee, because when there's a lot of light, you just feel a little more exposed, like more people are going to see you doing something bad if you do something bad. So cheating went down. Then they put a mirror on the wall. Cheating went down again. People don't want to be seen cheating, even if it's only by themselves. They just feel more like they're being watched if there's a mirror. Bunch of experiments like that. It's crazy stuff. They replaced the mirror with a poster, just a drawing of two eyes. Cheating went down again. Because even with the eyes, people subconsciously felt like they were being watched, and they were therefore more honest. The experimenters said, oh, come on, that can't be it. So they replaced the next month the eyes with just a poster of some flowers. Cheating went up. They put the eyes back, cheating went down. Put the flowers back, cheating went up. Put the eyes back, cheating went down. Put the flowers back, cheating went up. It was the eyes. That's what made the difference. There are now cafeterias around the country, if you pay attention, you'll see them from time to time, where they put big drawings of eyes on the wall, because they found people are much more likely to bust their tables like they're supposed to after they're done if those eyes are on the wall. In my favorite iteration of the study, they said, hey, did you hear? Joe thought he saw a ghost in the coffee room. Cheating went down again because people don't want to be spotted cheating, even by a ghost, it appears. That's transparency. Again, lots of studies showing the same thing. It's crazy stuff. So I'm getting ready to answer some questions here. But the bottom line is, it's really not easy to be a good person all the time. Because we've got bosses we want to please, and people around us that we want to get along with. And we want to get promotions and raises and hit bonus targets and get along with folks and succeed. But we also want to be good people. And if that's really important to us, we've got to keep that in our frame of reference all the time. We've got to watch those little slips so that incrementalism doesn't eat us up, the slippery slope doesn't eat us up. But if we're aware of these things and we guard against them, it improves our chances of being better people. None of us are going to get out of this life alive, having lived perfectly. But we can minimize the number and size of the mistakes we make if we keep these findings from behavioral ethics in mind. And again, if any of this is interesting to you at all, just go to ethicsunwrapped.utexas.edu. We've got a bunch of absolutely free videos that I think are very well done because I hired a filmmaker who's just awesome. She's really, really good. Questions that I can answer for anybody?